And joining us now, retired Canadian Forces Colonel Brian MacDonald, Senior Defense Analyst with the Conference of Defense Associations. Colonel, good to have you back at TVO.
Good to be with you, Steve.
Let us start by playing you some tape as we explore the issue of whether we've got enough boots on the ground to get the job done. This was an exchange in the House of Commons earlier this week, probably one that has, in some way, shape, or form, been replicated in coffee shops and dinner tables all across the country. This is a hot topic. Michael, roll tape, please.
Extended our troops in Afghanistan that it's now having to train naval and air force personnel in order to backfill in the combat role. And not only that, they're having to look at extending the tour of duty from 6 months to 9 months. And at the same time, we see voices of opposition growing across the country, including media reports today of families of those serving in the Afghanistan conflict raising concerns about the mission.
There is no intention of employing sailors or airmen or airwomen in infantry roles. As well, there is no intention of extending the time that people are in Afghanistan if they're in active operations.
Honourable member.
We got enough boots on the ground to get the job done?
I think in a fast answer, no. And part of this stems from the fact that the Canadian Forces have been reducing in strength for many, many years. And we're now at the stage of suddenly being involved in a heavy-duty warfighting role at the same time as we're trying to increase the number of people in the forces so that you have now a competition for those crucial warrant officers and sergeants and senior NCOs who do the critical leadership job on the ground in Afghanistan, but at the same time are the guys that you need to do the training of new soldiers back in Canada.
How many people we got in the armed forces altogether?
We have about 62,000 as the total paper strength.
Okay, now, but we've only got 2,000 or so troops over there, right?
Ah, yes. When you take that 62,000, you have to then subtract the people who are on retirement leave, the people who are undergoing training, the people who are in the actual training system itself, the people who are, through a variety of medical or other reasons, not available to you, the people who are locked away in the base administration, base infrastructure across the country, the people who are in the Air Force, the people in the Navy, so that when you come right down to the bottom of it, to the number of infantry and armored and artillery folks that you have on the ground, we have a much smaller group of people entirely.
What's the pool then at that point?
Well, at this point, the Army as a whole is about 19,000 people in uniform. But again, you've got that slice that comes out of the base infrastructure and such. So that when you're looking at all of our 9 infantry battalions, if they were up to their full war establishment, they would probably be something in the order of about 700 people each. And at this point, they're probably on the ground maybe 350, 400 perhaps. And as a consequence, then, when you're preparing a new rotation to go to Afghanistan, you will select a particular battalion to be the heart of that. But since the battalion is so under strength, you have to pull people in from other regular units to build the strength up. And we have to as well then rely upon the militia, who are at this point producing about 13% of the current rotation, and without whom we'd be in a world of hurt, to bring us up to that full manning level.
So one of the things that we've heard as a potential idea, you heard Jack Layton in the clip there talk about it, was the notion of, and he wasn't supporting this, he was just putting it out there, extending the term for our soldiers who are over there. What do you think of that idea?
We have, as a standard matter of policy, tried to arrange it so that a soldier spends 6 months rather, in preparation to go over to the next rotation, then another 6 months there, and then looking for another period of perhaps 3 rotations, 18 months, before that person can be thought of going back into the cycle again. For the simple purpose that you need the standard career progression training that takes place, you need to have some time with wives and families, and you need simply the downtime of not being in a high-intensity war environment.
So the minister has rejected that idea. Was he right to do so?
Well, I think that really what this proposal was looking at was not so much the idea of taking, say, a Navy sonar technician and trying to convert that person into infantry, but rather looking at the fact that there are some trades that are effectively doing the same job. I mean, a Navy cook is a cook. Cooking on a ship is different than cooking in the field, but you're looking at the cooking trade. So as a consequence, it's not too difficult to take a Navy cook and deploy that person conceptually somewhere else, or a communicator, or a supply technician, or a clerk administrative, this sort of thing.
Yeah, now, as I said that, it occurred to me I might be getting ahead of myself here, because what the Minister of Defense actually said was there is no intention to change the rules under which we send people over there, extend the term or shorten the time they're allowed to be back here or so on. Does that closed the door as far as you're concerned, hearing those words, we have no intention of doing it?
Well, when you use the term, we have no intention, the subtext is we have no intention right now of doing that.
Exactly.
But the context could change, and that could have a future impact. As indeed, in fact, we increased the number of troops deployed in Afghanistan by adding a company of Vandus to the current RCR battle group. The Vandus are going in to be basically a camp defensive force, which releases an RCR company to go out and do the warfighting role outside the wire.
RCR is?
Royal Canadian Regiment, which are based in Ontario, and they have a battalion in Gagetown in New Brunswick.
Okay. If there is no intention, and let's take him at his word, there are no plans on the books right now to change the length of service that soldiers are forced to do over there, or shorten the amount of time they can stay back here in Canada. What other options does the government have to get those numbers up?
Well, you can, again, attempt to draw more people out of the militia, the reserves, although I think probably we're just about at the limit there, because the reserves themselves, like the regular force, are under strength. And there tends to be a much higher turnover in the reserves because of the fact that they draw from high school students for a shorter period of time. So I think we're probably at the limit there. I think as well we're looking at the possibility of relying on some other contributions from the other NATO nations. And some have stepped up to the table, and some are quite obvious by their absence.
I'm going to get into that more in just a few minutes, but I want to pursue one more thing before we leave this area, and that is, we've got what, 2,300 soldiers over there?
2,400 with the additional deployments.
How many do we need?
I think that here what the NATO analysis has been is that within the brigade that the Canadians are part of, and we've just are coming to the end of the period in which Brigadier General Fraser is the brigade commander, who'll be replaced by a Brit, that brigade probably needs another battle group, a battalion, to give them a ready reserve that they can then deploy to deal with an emergency that is perhaps a case of one of the other units is now under heavy pressure and needs to be suddenly reinforced. The brigade commander is really looking for that sort of a beefing up of his resources at this point.
But I've heard you say we're at our limits here. We really have very few options. I haven't heard sort of a spectacular one jump off the page yet as to how we can get the numbers up to where you think they ought to be. Does that just simply mean it can't be done?
No, because again, we look to the NATO alliance.
Besides NATO, for Canada to increase its numbers.
We could increase the period of time that people are deployed there. We could shorten the period of time that they're not employed between rotations. We don't want to do that. We're at the same time trying to build up the total number of people in the forces, to expand the forces by another 10,000 people. And the recruiting side is going quite well, but the system itself is designed for a smaller force, and it's having real troubles in ramping up the processing time. And then we have the problem of the training of those soldiers and the problem of finding where we're going to get those skilled instructors from.
Well, Colonel, I'm glad you mentioned recruitment going well, because it may have gone well, or it may be going well in part because of some very different ads that the armed forces are running these days. I want to show a snippet of one ad that's running right now, and then we'll come back and talk about it, okay? Roll tape, please, Michael. I know that when we were watching these ads this afternoon in preparation for this, many people observed that these are not exactly the ads of yesteryear with the soldier carrying the briefcase.
The briefcase,
and, you know, we're going to train you for a great career after. Exactly. No, this is you know, come with us, and I mean, I don't want to be too superficial about this, but you know, join the forces, and you're going to go to dangerous places around the world and probably have to kill people. Is that the way to recruit more soldiers? It
was interesting. Years ago, I did a study of the attrition of privates and corporals in Toronto Militia District. And one of the questions that I was interested in finding an answer to was to try to develop an idea that there might be some linkage between a reason to join the forces as a predictor of being willing to stay in the forces. And I found that there were two factors which had a very high correlation between intent to remain in the forces. And those were, I joined because I wanted challenge and adventure, and I joined because I wanted to serve my country. And if you heard both of those two motivations coming out in the course of the recruiting interview, then you knew that if you grabbed that guy, you were going to get a person who's going to stay with you for a long time. And I think that we're seeing exactly the same sort of response at this point, because people who are interested, young people, in challenging themselves, of meeting a standard, of testing themselves, are looking to this as an opportunity to, in fact, engage in an extremely challenging environment, and at the same time doing something that is really useful and worthwhile, and committing themselves to Canada and the national objectives. Well, so I think that impact is why we're having the increased success in getting people through the front door.
Sure. Now tell me this, though. If somebody's watching this program in Kapuskasing tonight, 20-year-old kid, saw that ad, is motivated by the things you just said, how long between tonight, when the kid from Kapuskasing sees that ad, and the time when that kid from Kapuskasing ends up in Kandahar?
Well, here, of course, we're talking of two different questions. One is the ability of the recruiting system to process the person quickly. The second one is the problem of the training system, to the series of steps that has to go through before that person can be actually deployed. We've had a real problem in the last number of years with the delays, the bureaucratic delays in the training system, and the CDS has really made a heavy-duty emphasis upon getting those things out of the way so we can get people into the training process. When you get to people who are now through the initial process, you've got a basic training period that they have to go through, which is, in fact, is the same basically for anybody in the Air Force or the Army or the Navy. It's the adjustment to the uniformed environment. And once that basic training is over, then the person goes into a period of individual training in the particular classification.
This sounds like it's all taking a long time.
It takes a long time.
How long
because,
does it take?
Well, I mean, we could probably look at something in the order of, again, it depends on the classification. Some of them are, the technical ones are extremely long, but the infantry side, the combat arms are perhaps a bit shorter to get sort of a basic qualification.
1 year, 2 years?
1 year, maybe. Then, of course, you've got the problem of the collective training that you have to go through, because you've got to be part of a team. You know, if you're in a LAV 3, you've got the sergeant who is commanding the LAV, you've got a driver, you've got a machine gunner, you've got the infantry guys in the back, and they have to work as a really tightly knit team because they are literally depending on each other for their lives.
The Canadians, the Dutch, and the Brits are doing most of the dirty work over there right now, the hard fighting, the hard slogging in southern Afghanistan.
Plus some Danes, some Estonians, some Australians,
and Americans,
and some Americans.
No French, no German, no Spanish, no Italian. How come?
Because they are located in the north part of Afghanistan, where things are comparatively quiet. And they are then organizing and running the provincial reconstruction teams in that area, which are at this point, since it's quiet in terms of combat, they can get on and do the reconstruction jobs. But they have, for example, in the case of the Germans, placed what are called caveats on the use of the German troops, that they will not be permitted, for example, to be used in the southern part of Afghanistan. Well, because you're dealing then with German politicians, a coalition government, and the politicians looking over their shoulders and saying, if somebody gets killed, it's going to hit us in the votes in the next election.
Yeah, but this is a war.
Absolutely. And this, of course, is causing a lot of tension within the alliance because of these major states in Europe not carrying the burden, whereas, interesting enough, of course, some of the smaller states are. I mean, we've got an offer from the Poles to add a battalion in 2007. The Romanians are offering to add another battalion. So some of the Europeans, particularly the new members of the alliance, are in there pulling their weight. We are more skeptical of the role of some of the older major members of the alliance.
You were in uniform for, what, 35 years or something?
23 years, regular and reserve service.
Starting in the 1950s,
Oh, 1957, I entered the Royal Military College.
If you were in the field right now, in uniform, being shot at, what would your opinion be of the French and German and Italian and Spanish soldiers who were not?
Well, my opinion of the French and the Spanish and the German soldiers would be that these are very good soldiers. My opinion of their national governments would be rather different.
Enough said. I think I know what you mean by that. Without more help, can Canada maintain its commitment in Afghanistan until 2009?
I think that we can maintain our commitment at this point. It's going to be stretched, particularly as we get more and more involved in the war-fighting element and are then beginning to take casualties, because there's also a requirement to have a flow of reinforcements to replace people who are either killed or, much more of them, wounded and required to be then lifted out, particularly if these are people in command slots, because it is a lot more difficult to replace a sergeant, because you're depending upon 15 years of experience. Sure. Than it is to replace a soldier.
Okay, let's conclude tonight by talking about whether or not this mission needs rethinking. You've seen public opinion polls, you've heard politicians talk about this. There is a lot of discussion in this country right now about whether or not our troops are engaged in the right mission, whether we're over there doing the right thing. People talk about the balance. Certainly New Democrats have said there's way too much military and not nearly enough development happening by Canadian personnel over there. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that the first of all, of course, is that without a secure environment, development simply can't take place. So you've got to have the military involvement. I think that there are reasonable questions being asked about the way in which we are delivering aid for development in the country. The Canadian International Development Agency has normally chosen to work through international organizations such as the World Bank to provide block funding to that organization, which then negotiates with the national government, where in fact we've had a team of Canadian Forces folks helping them learn how to do things administratively. But the process is slow, whereas Brigadier General Fraser, who's our brigade commander over there, has said, look, I need a comparatively small amount of money, $9 or $10 million, which then I would have the authority to spend on the basis of my discussions with the local folks that I'm in touch with all the time, who say, we need to have this road fixed here. And then if I had the money, I could do the development process of fixing that road, because of course my combat engineers know how to fix roads. And in that way we could deliver the development, the assistance at the sharp end to the folks who need it when they need it, and you then have a visual impact, a very obvious impact upon the relationship between the Canadians and the local folks.
Colonel, I'm going to read you an excerpt from the Senless Council's the International Think Tank's report. You've seen this report, I'm sure. I'm going to put some of it up here on the screen here. Part of their report says, Canada should take the lead on Afghanistan on the international stage. Following U.S. policies in Afghanistan has directly led to the deaths of the Canadian military there. U.S. bombing, U.S. military approaches, and U.S.-led poppy crop eradication schemes have all created an environment hostile to all NATO troops. The Canadian troops in Kandahar are doing a heroic job in extremely difficult circumstances, and they are to be commended. But the policies under which they are obliged to work are putting them at risk. So says Noreen MacDonald from the Senless Council. What's your view on that comment?
Well, I've read the Senless report with considerable care, and a number of their conclusions are conclusions that nobody would disagree with. I mean, they talk about there being a poverty crisis in Afghanistan, and by heavens, is that ever right? They talk about there being an opium crisis, and Afghanistan at this point produces 92% of the world global supply of opium and heroin as its derivative. And they talk about a security problem. I mean, these are all right. These are fair statements. They have a very novel proposal, and that was that we would then, instead of allowing the farmers sell their raw opium to the drug traffickers, that we would deploy people in there to buy it directly and to convert it into medical opiates for use around the world.
What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's a novel idea, but of course when I look at the environment's realities, I keep thinking of Al Capone in Chicago on the South Side in the 1920s, when Bugsy Moran decided he was going to muscle in on Capone's booze trade. And that resulted in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when 7 of Bugsy Moran's gang got lined up beside the end of a garage and machine gunned to death. The guys who are in the drug traffickers, who've got a $2.3 billion industry, are not going to be very happy about being cut out of that by the people, say, from Senless, who are going in to buy the opium directly from the farmers.
Can we buy them off?
Well, if we could,
spending that money militarily anyway, aren't we?
It would cost about probably $750 million. If it were a practical idea, then it would be a very cost-effective one. But quite frankly, I don't see that the concept is going to go over very well with the drug traffickers, and I think that we would be then in a position of having to have even more Canadian forces escorting the drug buyers out to make the buy.
Well, having said that, let me show you one more chart before we conclude our discussion. And this chart shows you what's been happening with the poppy trade. Here's opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan over the past decade and a half. And as you can see, whether it's during the Soviet period of occupation, whether it's during the Civil War, whether it's during the Taliban, whether it's now that the Americans have come in under Karzai's leadership, poppy cultivation is always going up and up and up and up. Is this a country that is ever going to get off the dependence of that trade?
Well, it's interesting again, 2.3 billion the drug traffickers cut. The actual natural revenue base of the Afghan government is about 350 million, about 1/10 the size. So you get this huge disparity in the amount of money that each side has available to it. Until we're able to strengthen, to build capability in that Afghan civilian government, which is going to take a long time, then we are facing this problem of dealing with the drug traffickers who are in fact supporting the Taliban operations against the government and against the Canadian forces.
Right. People may have noticed there was one bar on that chart that was very low, and of course that was in 2001, right after the invasion.
Was that because the poppy gets planted the previous year. The Taliban, when they took power, did nothing to interfere with the opium trade until late in their period, when they're trying to get some international approval. They cut it off for 1 year, and then the next year, at the point where the Americans were about to invade, they said, okay, you can go back and grow poppy, because they, at that point, were trying to get public support.
Okay. Colonel MacDonald, good of you to come in tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
Steve, I'm always glad to talk.
Appreciate it.